Good afternoon and welcome to Politics and the Pulpit here on KHTS AM 1220 and 98.1 FM, the show where we talk about the two things we're not supposed to ever talk about in public, religion and politics. On our show, not only do we talk about those two things, but they clearly mix. This is the Bishop of Santa Clarita. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and looking forward to a great conversation with a pastor friend up in Minnesota. I wanted to just quickly mention, for those of you that are sick of the warm weather that we're having here in Southern California, hey, just wait another 48 hours. It's supposed to drop about 20 degrees tomorrow and another 25 degrees on Friday, so feels like we're going to get a little tease of fall for the next couple of days, maybe 72 hours, and then unfortunately it's going to pop right back up there by next Monday up into the low 90s. But hey, as long as those overnight lows stay pretty chilly, that allows you to open those windows at night and give that air conditioning a break as well as your electric bill. Well, I got a guest on today that we're going to have on for a couple of segments, and he's calling all the way in from the great state of Minnesota. And of course, we know Minnesota is the state of, well, the guy that wants to be the next vice president of the United States. And that, of course, is Tim Walz. Levi Secord is the founding pastor of Christ Bible Church in Roseville, Minnesota. And he graduated with a Master of Divinity and a Doctorate of Educational Ministry from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And we are discussing an article that he has written for World Magazine entitled, quote, "Ready for the Radical Leftism of Governor Walz." Who better to speak on the radical leftism of Governor Walz than somebody who lives in Governor Walz State? Pastor Levi, thanks for tuning in and calling in to Politics in the Pulpit.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
First of all, how's the weather there in Minnesota? Is it as good as it is here in Southern California, or should we not even talk about that?
It's 77 and sunny, so it's pretty perfect.
That's actually great. At what point in Minnesota weather does it start to kind of, get bad?
You know, I don't mind November, December. It can be warm. It can be 20s, 30s. It could be 40s, 50s. But January and February are pretty miserable.
Does church attendance go down during those times of month, Levi? How does that work?
They do to an extent, but really the church attendance goes lowest here, and this is every church I know of, in the summer, because people travel so much in the summer. There's lake houses, lake cabins that people are always visiting. So attendance dips quite a bit normally in the summer, and then church growth happens.
Yeah. And how popular is ice fishing up there?
It's very popular, but I don't do it. I love normal fishing. I don't love being on a frozen lake.
Yeah, I think you and me both on that. I've seen some of your catches on Facebook here, so I'm glad that you enjoy one of those things that I enjoy as well. Well, let's discuss this this article that you wrote for World Magazine, The Sound Journalist, Grounded in Facts and Biblical Truth. And I'd encourage folks to check that out online. And again, that's World Magazine. And you can read all kinds of interesting articles by both Levi as well as Megan Basham, who just wrote a book that just came out and causing all kinds of stir called Shepherds for Sale, and other great opinion writers as well. So you live in Minnesota, Levi. Tell us a little bit about this article. Why did you write it, and why did you feel like you needed to warn the rest of the nation for this Midwestern moderate?
Yeah, Midwestern moderate. Yeah, not likely. I grew up in Minnesota. I've done ministry here now for 11 years. On top of that, I've spent most of my life in the state. I really do love the state, minus January and February. I really do love it. I'm a lifelong traumatized Vikings fan. I love all the local sports teams and all the disappointment they bring. But the politics have gotten really out of hand in the last decade or so, particularly the last 2 years. When people were theorizing that Tim Walz was going to be the VP pick, I laughed it off. I thought there was no chance because I knew what an abject failure he was. And then I got an email from World, because I'd done some writing for them in the past when Walz got picked. And they said, hey, can you write an article about what it's like living there? And I said, sure. I've got plenty of experience with this situation. And so I sat down that day, wrote it. It was published the next day. But, yeah, It's crazy. It's one of those few times I've seen both sides of the aisle be happy about the VP pick. The Democrats were very happy. They thought they had this Midwest moderate, and the Republicans were very happy because they're like, this guy is not a moderate. He's kind of crazy. And as we've seen in the cycles now, I mean, he's being caught. He lies all the time. He's just a habitual liar, and that's not news to me in the slightest.
Now, why do you think Tim Walz actually won in Minnesota? Is that because basically the inner cities made the decision for you guys out in the rural part of the country? What's going on?
Yeah, so I mean, he won re-election, and I don't know. Like, Minnesota's pretty blue, and it's been getting even more so. Like in my article, I started off by talking about how in the last several years Minnesota's seen its largest population decline, kind of like California.
Yeah.
People are fleeing the state, and it's a net loss. The number isn't that great net loss, but you also have to remember this is the most we've seen in about 30 years. But it's also more people than that left. We've also brought in a lot of immigrants. So the total net loss, the actual people who've been here a while who have left is quite a bit larger probably than that number shows. And we've actually had a fair bit of immigration or migration from California to Minnesota too. So I think we've had some blue people flee California to another blue state. And so the cities in particular are really dark blue. We have one of the largest Somali populations outside of Somalia in the world. We have, it's the home of Ilmar Ohan.
Yep.
It's not accidental. But outside of the Twin Cities, Governor Walz is not popular. During the pandemic, he said something along the lines of, when asked why don't people outside of the Twin Cities like him, he says, well, there's only rocks and cows out there anyway. And so that didn't go over particularly well. And for a year or so, or maybe longer, and you can probably still find some in outstate Minnesota, there were billboards up all across our state citing that statement, and also with other funny graphics that I can't describe as a pastor on those billboards making fun of Tim Walz. So he's not particularly popular along real Midwesterners who live in small towns, who are farmers, etc. You go into that part of the state, and it's as red as it gets, and you will find Trump stores and lots of strong dislike for Tim Walz.
One of the things that was trending on Twitter and other social media platforms about 48 hours after Kamala had made the choice to have Tim Walz as her running mate was this notion of Tampon Tim. Exactly why was that trending, and can you tell the listeners a little bit about the Tampon Tim story?
Yeah, so in the midterms, the Democrats in Minnesota finally gained control of both the House and the Senate, along with the governorship. So for a while, under Tim's first term, he was largely kept in check. And so when they finally got the majority in the Senate, and it's right now just a one-seat majority, and that one swing district was determined by about 200 votes. And when we went to bed that night, the Republican was winning, but hey, they found some ballots, and he ended up losing by 200 votes. And with that one-seat majority, they have pushed through every radical agenda that they want with almost no defection ever from any of the Democrats at the state level on it. Whatever they wanted, they got. So they had the Tampon Tim thing where they required menstrual products to be in boys and girl bathrooms of all of the schools in Minnesota because of the transgender stuff. That is, it's a catchy slogan, but that's not by far, in my opinion, the worst thing he did. The transgender refuge law that they pushed through, the abortion laws that he pushed through are far more egregious than that. That's just much more of a catchy slogan.
Well, obviously in your article here, you write this, children and families are not safe after birth in Minnesota, while some European countries are coming to terms with the evident dangers of transgenderism. Walz has plowed ahead undeterred. In 2023, Walz signed into law the Trans Refuge Act, which turned Minnesota into a refuge for children to flee from other states to be chemically and or physically mutilated. Obviously, that's pretty self-descriptive, Levi, but go ahead and fill the listeners in on exactly what this Trans Refuge Act would provide in the state of Minnesota.
Well, the Democrats wanted to respond to a bunch of the red states, including some of our neighbors who were starting to ban those procedures for minors, which, again, any sane, rational person would be like, yeah, we probably don't want to do irreversible harm to minors who are in a vulnerable condition, but hey, whatever. I guess we're the weird ones according to them. But they ended up pushing through this Trans Refuge Act so that people could flee to Minnesota, including minors, against the will of their parents. They could become wards of the state, and even children within the state could have become, or the parents could lose their rights and their authority over their children, or their custody over their children. And so the way the bill is written, and it's somewhat murky, but this received a lot of national attention at the time, lots of protests and whatnot. And I was involved with some lobbying of some senators behind closed doors trying to get them to see this and vote against it. They didn't believe that it does what it actually does do, but what it does is in the part of the statutes where we talk about when family courts can take custody from children, and right alongside abuse and neglect is now refusing to provide gender-affirming care. Okay, of course, not actual real gender-affirming care, which would be affirm the gender you were born with.
Yeah.
But it's okay if you won't let your kid who wants to be chemically or physically castrated, if you won't let them do that, the courts now, according to the Minnesota statutes, have the right to take that into consideration to remove custody of your children. That is not a Midwestern moderate. Right? That is insanity. That is absurd. Right? The state and political bureaucrats know better how to raise your children than you do, and we have rights over your children that we can take them if we disagree with how you're raising your children.
Yeah,
that we can do irreparable harm to them.
That is absolutely ridiculous, and of course, the only governor in the United States that would probably agree with that in an affirming way, of course, is our own governor here in California. We have something very similar to the Trans Refugee Act here in California, and of course, one of the things that I always find interesting is a lot of people don't realize that once these procedures take place, that people are unable to have children. And obviously that might be an insidious reason for doing this in one aspect, aka the Green New Deal and population control. But that's just my conspiratorial tinfoil hat coming out right there. But yeah, some of these folks are not going to be able to have children. Is that right?
As far as I can tell, and again, Europe is shifting on this. Like the scientific medical data on this is incredibly clear. And at some point, even here in America, that's going to be undeniable. And people are going to look back and they're going to say, what did we do? How did we ever buy into this? How did we ever do this to our children? Like we become somewhat like numb to it, but like this is certifiably insane.
Absolutely.
What they're arguing for and what they're doing. And it's not okay. And we need to use strong language in condemning it. And so in no way, shape, or form, at least socially, can we portray Tim Walz as some sort of shucks Midwestern moderate who would be able to walk into a small town and agree with anybody in that small town in the Midwest. Not even close.
So what I've been hearing, Levi, is that when Tim was actually in Congress, he was actually far more moderate, more malleable in his positions than he has been since being governor. Is that your understanding of Tim Walz? Did he evolve into this progressive lunatic, or has he always been?
I don't know. I mean, I think you see a lot from politicians that if you're in more of a swing district, you moderate your views so that you get elected. I mean, Barack Obama was against gay marriage until he was 4. He wasn't up for election anymore. But before that, he was for gay marriage, and then he changed. So, I mean, people on the right do that as well. I don't exactly trust that this was an actual change of conscience kind of thing.
Yeah. Before we talk about the Governor Walz's response to Minneapolis burning for days on end in 2020 during those riots, I wanted to ask you a question about the polling. Obviously, prior to July of 2024, all polling had Kamala Harris down in the dumps, even below Joe Biden. As far early as February of this year, there were CNN pundits saying out loud, we think that Kamala is a drag on the Biden ticket, and they were actually out loud talking about the possibility of replacing her. And now all of a sudden, since Biden jumped out of the race and then endorsed Kamala within 48 hours, all of a sudden she's the second coming of Jesus Christ, and she's Barack Obama in female form. Right. So obviously we know there's response bias when it comes to a lot of these polls. And we also know that the media industrial complex is really, really pushing for a rebranding of her. So what is your take, Pastor Levi, on the polling, the media industrial complex, and just the whole rebranding effort?
Well, I think for sure she's probably picked up some favorability in how they've rebranded, but I don't think we should trust the polls at all. If you're tracking at all, you can listen to some of the podcasts by Rasmussen Reports, which is a truly independent polling agency. And from what I understand, they were ranked the fourth most accurate the last cycle around, and even they overprojected Democrats last time around. And they currently right now have Trump winning by 4 points, and that's been pretty consistent. There's other polls out there, Fox News +1. I'm looking at the data right here, CNNBC +1. And then if you look at the top, like comparatively, let's say, so Real Clear Polling, Real Clear Politics has an aggregate total. They have Harris winning by 1.5 right now. On this date in 2020, Biden was polling 7.5 points ahead, and Clinton in 2016 was polling 5.3 points ahead. The fact that she is on this aggregate doing that poorly does not mean she's popular. It means she's doing terribly historically. And Rasmussen talks about this and other things, and that polls are really easy to manipulate. They don't think that she's actually even winning in those polls, but they're probably intentionally oversampling Democrats to get the results that they want. And I think that's probably accurate.
I'm gonna save the question about Minnesota burning for after the break here, Pastor Levi, but I wanted to ask you this right before we go to break. Obviously, Monday was the first night of the DNC, and Joe Biden did not get to speak in prime time. Do you think that was a Democratic plan to make sure that he did not get a primetime slot, even though technically he was supposed to get a primetime slot, but it ended up being way into the wee hours of the Eastern time zone?
Yeah, of course it was. I mean, all of these things are calculated as to who gets the best speaking spot. It's the same thing when after George W. was gone, that nobody wanted to talk about him on the Republican side. It's not an accident, right? They know he's very unpopular and very clearly incompetent.
Just read a story today where I forget the news site that just put it out, but I guess they're starting to slowly report on the fact that we knew about Joe's cognitive decline a long time ago, but just didn't report on it. And it's funny how these media industrial complex folks will slowly bleed out those stories as Biden himself becomes more unpopular, and then of course as Harris is on the ascendancy. I'm just kind of hoping, Pastor Levi, that folks can see through that, but unfortunately, maybe I just don't have as much hope as some people have in humanity. What say you?
Well, the reality of the matter is we all have to live in the real world, and bad ideas produce bad results, and eventually the people turn. So to me, the idea is not if, but when. And then the other question is how much damage is done before people realize that this ain't working.
Absolutely. When we come back here on Politics in the Pulpit, again, we're talking with Pastor Levi Secord, the pastor of Christ Bible Church in Roseville, Minnesota. We're talking about his article that he wrote for World Magazine a couple weeks ago, basically saying that the Midwestern moderate known as Tim Walz is not really a moderate at all. And so we'll talk a little bit about Minnesota burning in 2020, COVID relief scandal, and other things that Pastor Levi can speak of authoritatively when we come back here on Politics in the Pulpit. See you in just a second. All right, we're back live for our bottom of the hour with your holy host, the Bishop of Santa Clarita, Pastor Jerry Cook, here on Politics in the Pulpit on your hometown station. If you're just joining us, we're talking to Pastor Levi Secord, who is the founding pastor of Christ Bible Church in Roseville, Minnesota, and he has written a great article for World Magazine entitled "Ready for the Radical Leftism of Governor Walz." Let's go right headlong into the radical leftism. We've already talked much about it during our first segment, but I want to talk about this notion that he had signed this PRO-ACT bill basically entrenching Minnesota as a global outlier on abortion policy. In other words, Walz signs an abortion up to birth bill. Fill the listeners in on that, if you would, Pastor Levi.
Yeah, so even again, if you were to compare us to Europe, I mean, like most European countries have a ban on abortion at like 15 to 20 weeks, somewhere in there, even though they're far more socially left than we are as a country. And so our abortion law here in Minnesota is like internationally comparative to North Korea, that bastion of civil rights, North Korea. And so what Walz and Company did is they removed all restrictions on abortion up to the moment of birth. They enshrined it in the statutes. They're trying to enshrine it in the Constitution, maybe in the next election cycle, but they enshrined it in the statutes of a right to abortion up to the moment of birth. This includes partial birth abortion, which, as I mentioned in my article, includes the crushing of the skull of an infant.
Yeah.
Now, I had somebody online call me out to say that when I said that turned the article into satire. This tells you how brainwashed people on the left really are. You can look it up. You can find it on Wikipedia. You can find it in medical journals. I can't remember exactly what the medical term they use is for partial birth abortion, but that's what they do. Because in order to get the head through, they have to crush the head of the infant. That is illegal. That is legal here in Minnesota up to the moment of birth. But if that wasn't bad enough, they removed from the state statutes in Minnesota the requirement that if a baby were to be born alive after a failed abortion, that they were required to receive medical treatment. So they stripped the language of that from the state statutes that then now allows that if a baby is born alive in the hospital room, that they can leave it there. They can leave that child, that helpless child, to die. And at least one report puts it at it. That happened to at least 5 children here in Minnesota. That may make you feel uncomfortable, that you don't want to believe it, that it's sensational. It is sensational, but it's true. That is the abortion laws here in Minnesota. Again, is that a moderate position? If that's a moderate position, then we must be living in Assyria or Babylonia in ancient times, because that is not moderate.
And the Democrats are gaslighting as many people as possible when it comes to their party saying that they don't support abortion up to the birth of the child. I have an article right here because I know that people always have a trouble with this type of stuff. It's from January 31st, 2023. It's a press release from St. Paul. It says, quote, "Today, Governor Tim Walz signed into law the Protect Reproductive Options, PRO." Isn't it great how they're always so wonderful how they call these bills?
Yeah, whatever the name of the bill is, it's the exact opposite.
Absolutely. Protect Reproductive Options to enshrine in state statute a fundamental right to abortion without limits or safeguards. The bill had passed the House and Senate by narrow margins after DFL leaders quickly pushed it through the legislature in the opening week of the session. And here's essentially what this PRO Act says. It means a right to abort any baby for any reason at any time up to birth. It means that the elective killing of a human being in utero is perfectly legal even in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, when the child can feel excruciating pain and could live outside the womb. It means that parents have no right to know when their teenage daughter has been taken to undergo an abortion. And the article goes on to say that Governor Walz's absolutist abortion policy puts Minnesota in the company of just a small handful of countries, as you stated earlier, Levi, around the world, like North Korea and China, which of course is not good company to be in with. And then there was a poll.
Walz loves China, so
no doubt. And there was a poll conducted a few months before this particular bill was signed by Governor Walz from Survey USA. Poll shows that most Minnesotans and most Americans disagree with no limits policies enshrined by the PRO Act. And of course, you and I would agree that we want, the absolute abolition of abortion this second if we can get it. But the fact of the matter is, the majority of Americans see this type of a bill, and they see it for what it is, which is a horror show and not reproductive rights at all.
Yeah, it's barbaric, I believe is the word I used in the article. It's barbaric.
It is. And that's exactly what you use. So the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about in terms of this article, Pastor Levi, is this here, and I'm going to quote, "What policies would prompt those with deep roots in the culture of Minnesota to uproot their families?" You say, quote, "We could look at how Walz let Minneapolis burn for days in 2020 and his lack of support for law enforcement, or how crime in the Twin Cities appears out of control." What were your thoughts during the summer of 2020 when not only Minneapolis, of course, was burning, but of cities all across the nation? But of course, Minneapolis is your backyard. What were you thinking at the time, and and Waltz's response?
Yeah, I mean, we got a front row seat to it. We had gas stations shut down in our neighborhood. Everything was boarded up. They took railroad cars to block entrances to buildings and stores and whatnot. And we got to turn on the news every night and watch Minneapolis go up in flames and the police precinct get burned to the ground. And people were asking for days. Now people are like arguing over it now. Well, 4 days, it's not that long. It's like it was when you were going through it.
Yeah.
And people were asking for days, calling the National Guard, calling the National Guard. I believe one of the mayors even asked Walz to do it, and he didn't until I think after that precinct was burned to the ground. And, of course, the Democrats are trying to spin themselves as pro-police now and pro-law and order. But you really have to be pretty sold out to brainwashing to believe that. 4 years ago wasn't that long ago. We all saw the push to defund the police. We have police officers being charged for things and thrown in jail or put on trial for things that they didn't, that you wouldn't have ever tried to prosecute a police officer before. Wonder why we're having shortages and why people don't want to be police officers in Minnesota, right? And then you have higher crime rates and theft and robbery in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. As bad as the migration out of state has been, it's worse in Hennepin County where Minneapolis is. They've lost over, I think it's about 50,000 residents net, or total, like net. So more have moved in. Again, we have lots of immigrants moving in to Minneapolis, and net, we've lost at least 50,000 people who've said, we're out of here. So the number's probably higher than 50,000 who've actually moved out saying, we don't want to live in this anymore. And people vote with their feet.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's happening here in California as well. And we know that it seems like Tim Walz and Gavin Newsom are vying for the most liberal governors in the nation.
Well, Walz did say at one point in his State of the State address that he was trying to make Minnesota the anti-Florida. That Florida's one way, and we're going to be the exact opposite. And he didn't just mean the weather.
Wow. That is, I mean, you talk about brain dead. One of the things you also said here towards the end of your article, Pastor Levi, is that, and thankfully this was squashed, but obviously there's some new proposed amendments to kind of resurrect this, but it says here, Walz and Democrats in Minnesota sought to coerce religious institutions to hire against their sincerely held beliefs. Democrats enacted a change to employment law that would have forced religious institutions, including churches, to hire against their beliefs about sexuality and gender. But obviously this was squashed by a lot of good Bible-believing churches staying in opposition to it. However, we know what happens when Democrats get defeated. They come back with some other reworded draft proposal, and so they're trying to do something very similar. So isn't this weird that the Democrats talk about Christians and other groups forcing their beliefs down other people's collective throats? But that's precisely what they're doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, that whole thing, so they passed this little-known change to employment law. No one caught it until the next year, and they brought it to the committee. I can't remember if it was the House or the Senate, and they said, hey, you clearly didn't mean to do this to mean that because they basically removed churches and the religious exemption for churches for non-discriminatory or religious institutions for non-discriminatory hiring practices in relation to gender identity or sexual orientation. So they just removed that. So, and they're like, clearly you didn't mean to do that. So you don't want churches and places to have to hire against their stuff. And the author of the bill and the committee basically said, yeah, we did. And then they accused all religious organizations. There were Muslims there. There were Jews there. They accused them all of being bigots, and this is backwards, and we're going to stand against this. And this just blew up around the state because there were several different committee meetings that went that way, and they just accosted any religious person who would want to hire, or any religious institution that would want to hire based on their own beliefs, right? And so I was in a meeting with a group of Christian schools and churches, and we were considering what legal action, preemptive legal action to take, because it was on the public record now what they were going to do with it, and the backlash grew so much that a compromise was reached in which instead of adding that language back into it, they just put a citation to a different section where it mentions on, because they had to still appease their base. And so that was dealt with, but now they're trying to do it through a different amendment to the state constitution. And so it's like one step forward, two steps back. But it's very clear the Democrat Party is not the party of free speech. It's not the party of religious liberty. And they want power to coerce belief and to demand submission on these things.
Well, I think you know the quote by Francis Schaeffer. I believe it was Francis Schaeffer said, if there is no God above the state, then the state becomes God. And
Yep.
that is essentially what is happening, or what has been happening right before our very eyes. Do you think that the Muslim population in Minnesota, as well as in Dearbornistan in Michigan, do you believe that the Muslim population has the same problem that the secular Jewish population has, which is their chronic desire to just vote Democratic? Why is that the case?
Yeah, I think there's some of that. I think some of that's softening. I think they said, and one study found that the Muslim vote for Republicans increased by 10% in the midterms from the prior election, and they're expecting it to do that again. And a lot of it has to do over these sexuality issues. There's a group of Muslim parents, for example, here in Minnesota, who went at it with the school board, wanting to be able to opt out their children from the sex ed, pro-LGBTQ stuff. And then the Democratic school board turned on the Muslims and was attacking them. Some conservative organizations came in and helped the Muslim parents and eventually got a win for them on that in religious liberty. So I think there is some softening, as ironic as that sounds, because Islam is proving to be tough in some respects to actually being fully secularized. Right? And so how does that break politically in the near future in America? I'm not sure, but it's definitely something to keep our eyes on.
So somebody brought to my attention, and this is completely off topic here from your article to World Magazine, but somebody brought to my attention a website, Evangelicals for Harris. And I went on that website and read some of the interesting stuff on there. But of course, we know that there are going to be some evangelicals like Russell Moore and others, David French, that tend to be, limp-wristed on a lot of these issues. Your position, Pastor Levi, is probably going to be the same position that of my position, which is, if you are a Bible-believing, born-again believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, can you at all, in good faith and conscience, vote for this modern configuration called the Democratic Party?
Well, so here's the thing. The answer is can or versus should. Like, can a Christian vote for Democrats is, in essence, asking the question, can a Christian sin? Yes, you can sin. You can still be a Christian and do that. Should you? No.
Yeah.
Right? So your salvation is not determined by how you vote, right? But I think the better question is, morally, ought you to vote for a party that is anti-creational norms, anti-God, anti-the church? Like, literally, as I've dealt with as a pastor here, at least 2 different congregations, like, your brothers and sisters are losing their jobs over some of these things. They're being forced out because they won't bend the knee to this, and the Democrat Party is pushing that. Are you going to vote for a party that is going to use their power to attack your brothers and sisters in Christ and to cause them to lose their jobs? Because that's what's happening. That's real world. I'm dealing with that in ministry. I'm guessing you've probably dealt with similar situations where people are being punished for holding their Christian views and even being forced out of positions. Of course, I think eventually you win those court cases if you have the courage to stand up, but this is the real reality. So should Christians be voting for that? No. Now, about people like Russ Moore, who I had 2 classes with at Southern Seminary, I'm not surprised he's ended up where he was. The signs were all over there. If you could get past his clear rhetorical gifting, past his sweet-sounding voice, it was very clear what direction he was heading on 13 years ago when I first met him. Right? And so people like that, I think we're going to have a different conversation, because people who are leading this, I don't think are necessarily deceived, where I think there are some rank-and-file Christians who believe the lies told about Trump and Republicans and the lies about Harris and Walz's actual real positions. They get their news sources from bad news sources. They're deceived, and they're doing this in good faith, but with not the accurate knowledge. But people like Russ Moore, he should know better, and there will be a harsher judgment for those who should know better.
Absolutely, and I can't even imagine some of these guys like Russ Moore, David French, and others, especially a lot of the folks within the Gospel Coalition, that of course has been trending left for quite some time, and I think it's very apparent now. But I'll give you the last word on this, Pastor Levi, as we come to our final break here. Your thoughts about November 5th, 2024. Does Trump eke this out? Is the next 2.5 months, how crucial is that for Trump? And considering that the polling might be more like the polling in 2016, where they had Hillary up, by astronomical digits and winning places like Texas and Florida. Um, well, and of course, we saw how that ended up. With Trump ended up not only winning those states but also the Rust Belt states. Um, what are your thoughts about November 5th? And most importantly, let's say Trump does win. Can you imagine exactly what the state of the nation would be between November 6th and Inauguration Day on January 20th, 2025?
Well, Democrats will lose their mind. Some of them are already hinting at not handing over power, but I don't believe that, not even for a minute, because that would result in a civil war. I don't think anybody wants that at this point. So, yeah, I think if I'm handicapping the race, I think it's 60-40 that Trump wins. There's still a lot that can happen. There will be an October surprise. There always is. I don't think, though, that there's that many people whose votes are really in question, if that makes sense. I don't think there's that many people who haven't made up their mind already. That's why I don't believe the bounce numbers. It's mostly going to be on turnout. So I think the biggest problem we face as Christians, I was on a different radio program talking about this, is that there's a concerted effort, especially around the GOP's terrible rebranding, or not rebranding, that's a bad way to put it, their terrible compromise on abortion to suppress the evangelical vote.
Yeah.
I don't like what the GOP did. There are people out there who I think are being dishonest, like Joe Carter on the Gospel Coalition.
Yep.
I can't dive into it too much, but he's saying that the Republican Party is now pro-choice. No, they're not.
Yeah.
They're not pro-choice. They said the states can enact laws to limit abortion. That means even outlaw it. So there's a path forward in your party platform where abortion could be banned in all 50 states. You might say, Levi, that's not very likely. It's also not very likely to do that at the federal level right now either.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? But there is the way it's written, every state can decide for itself, and it's linked to the 14th Amendment and the guarantee of human rights. I think it was a bad move, but I think if Christians are going to say, well, I'm not going to vote because of that, well, just know where Walls and Harris are on this.
Absolutely. Pastor
Right?
Levi Secord,
Yeah.
pastor of Christ Bible Church in Roseville, Minnesota, thank you so much for joining us today. I encourage you to go to World Magazine and read Pastor Levi Secord's, not only his latest article, but the many that he's written before that, Ready for Radical Leftism of Governor Walz. Pastor Secord, thank you so much. When we come back here on Politics in the Pulpit, we're going to talk about Nathan Hochman and his stabbing of the Republican base in just a second. All right, we're back here for our final segment on Politics in the Pulpit on your hometown station, AM 1220 and 98.1 FM. Again, go to World Magazine and look up Levi Secord, Secord, and look up Ready for the Radical Leftism of Governor Walz. I think you'll find his article very intriguing. How many of you out there know the Star-Spangled Banner? Or in other words, how many of you know our national anthem? You know, oh, say, can you see by the stars, that stuff. Here's what the Democratic Party sounded like on Monday, trying to follow along with our national anthem. Well, that's great, huh? I mean, that's going to be on American Idol really soon, or DC's Got Talent. I mean, that's just atrocious. I know the national anthem. I think most of us do. But this is what happens when a party has thrown in to collectively undermine American values and question everything about America. And it started years ago, and it's finally coming home to roost. Well, I teased you right before the break to talk about Nathan Hochman, and I've had Nathan Hochman on this show. I've had an opportunity to sit down with Nathan Hochman privately. Full disclosure, obviously I supported John Hatami for the DA's race, and that's who I still think would be the best choice against George Gascon in November. But Nathan Hochman has made some news here recently. It's not the kind of news that he really wants to make, but evidently he made a calculated decision to make this type of news. You say, what was it? Well, he went on Eric Michelson's show on Fox 11, local news, and was interviewed and made a very, from what I could tell, looking at his facial expressions and hearing the exuberance in his voice, a very full throttle endorsement for Kamala Harris. Now, it's no mistake that he already supported Biden prior to this. He is not a Trump supporter, hasn't voted for Trump in 2016, didn't vote for Trump in 2020, and is obviously going to vote for Harris in 2024. But one of the things he told me sitting in my office was this: I believe that we need to keep politics out of the DA's office. And he predicated that statement by saying, this is why I didn't run as a Republican or a Democrat. I'm running as an independent, because that was a sore spot for some of us out here. As we remember when he ran against Rob Bonta a few years ago, and he ran as a Republican. And of course, he was basically a Republican most of his life, having been appointed by George W. Bush and other Republicans in his career. But he told me the reason why he ran as an independent is because he wanted to keep politics out of the DA's office. Well, unfortunately, by him endorsing Kamala Harris, he has now injected politics straight into the DA's office. And many of the folks who supported Hochman over Hatami initially, men like Steve Cooley and others, have now rescinded their endorsements for Nathan Hochman. Now, privately, if you were to ask me, I know I'm on radio right now, do I want Hochman to win over Gascon? In a weird way, I do. But here's the problem, is I don't know if I can trust Hochman with that power now. I don't know if he's going to morph even more. I don't know if he's going to evolve even more. Listen, I am not telling you to sit out the DA's race. I'm not saying yeah, we can survive another 4 years in this county with George Gascon and his lawless policies. But at the same time, I'm so sick of Republicans or right-leaning independents who just take an absolute defecation on the base of the Republican Party. And one of the things I said was this: whether you like Trump or not, and I know there's plenty of people that don't like him, but one of the things I think why the base loves Trump as much as the base loves Trump, and why he has that base locked up, is because he has chosen to not crap on the base. And if you look at Republican candidates prior to Trump, Mitt Romney in 2012, John McCain prior to Romney, and then of course George W. Bush as well. In reality, folks, these guys essentially crapped on their base in order to go to the middle and try to get those disaffected Democrats and independents out there. And I get it. It's political, but I'm going to tell you exactly what Hochman told me. He made a calculated move, a politically calculated move, basically saying this in his mind: I know that the conservatives dislike Gascon and his policies so much that they are going to hold their nose to vote for me in November, even if I make the calculated move to support Kamala Harris. And I think it's the reason why Trump won in 2016. I mean, there's many other reasons, but one of the reasons is he was so loyal to his base. And one of the reasons why I think that he might win again in 2024 is because he's so loyal to his base. Republicans prior to Trump, by and large, not all of them, there are exceptions to the rule, obviously, but by and large, most Republicans have just taken a poop all over their base in order to go after Democrats and other groups. And again, I understand the politics of it. I know we want to broaden the tent, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you can broaden the tent without disaffecting your base. And that's essentially what Hochman has done. And again, I'm sure there are going to be Republicans and conservatives that are going to sit on their laurels when it comes to the DA's race on principle. And you know what? I'm not going to argue with that. If they want to sit home on principle when it comes to the DA's race, then, do what you have to do. I'm going to reluctantly vote for Hochman. I wasn't excited about Hochman when he became the second place winner. Like I said at the outset, I wanted Hatami. But this is one of the reasons why Trump is so popular with the Republican base and why he's so rock solid with them, is because he realizes that he needs to maintain that tight circle in his base. And Republicans prior to him, by and large, not all, but by and large, have just taken the base for granted. And Hochman is doing that in this DA's race. And it is so unfortunate because I believe Hochman could have won, and probably will win, but could have won without having endorsed Kamala Harris. Here's what he could have said when asked, who are you endorsing in the 2024 presidential election? He could have said, I decline to state. But no, he didn't do that. Thanks for tuning in today on Politics in the Pulpit. We're thankful that you gave us an opportunity to give you a little bit of light on the world of politics and religion. We'll catch you next week, same bad time, same bad channel. Take care.